Thank you all for being here tonight. Thanks to the Humanities Council and the Florida Humanities Council and to the Humanities Institute and all of you who've come out in this terrible rain, which I think is wonderful because it's not a foot of snow, which I've gotten used to. This is the first time, I think since October, that I've actually been able to go out with my sleeves rolled up. I had a t-shirt on today. I brought a pair of shorts with me. I guess I'll wear those later in the week. What I'd like to, sounds good? Okay. What I'd like to talk to y'all about tonight is the civil rights movement and particularly Black Power. And I'd like to get into the ways that Black Power has been misrepresented, the way that it's been misunderstood, and trying to straighten out some of that confusion. I was a teenager in the age of Black Power. I had a beret. I still have a black leather jacket. I'm wearing the blue shirt. You know, all those things that kind of went with the Panther Party, but my mother wouldn't let me join. So let me just start out by talking about the place where we first hear this term Black Power, or where we think we first heard this term Black Power. Let me play it for you.
Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. We want Black Power. 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 That's right. We want Black Power. We don't have to be ashamed of it. We have stayed here and we begged the president. We begged the federal government. That's all we've been doing. Begging, begging. It's now we stand up and take over. Take over. We have to do what every group in this country did. We got to take over the communities where we outnumber people so we can have decent jobs. So we can have decent houses. So we can have decent roads. So we can have decent schools. So we can have decent justice. Every courthouse in Mississippi ought to be burned down tomorrow to get rid of the dirt and that. Now from now on, when they ask you what you want, you know what to tell them. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? Everybody, what do you want? That's what we're going to get.
What started out as a chant at a moment of a march blew open into an entire social and political movement that also had resonance in the arts as late as the 1970s. Anybody in the room remember this? Yes. No one else? Okay, a couple people remember when this came out in the 70s. Great dance music as we move from the sadness and confusion and chaos of the movement into figuring out how we actually were going to find a place. And the way that you had to do that was by giving the people what they wanted.
When
stop. Won't stop. Okay, I'm sorry, it wouldn't stop. And there for a moment, I thought we were all going to have a dance and whatnot. So, Black Power, with assistance from Willie Ricks, the fellow organizer from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Stokely Carmichael fired up the crowd at an outdoor mass meeting with those words, Black Power. Black Power. The term engendered a collective moment of trembling. Among African Americans in the crowd, it was a tremble of excitement. Among African Americans in other places, it was a trembling of anticipation. Amongst most whites, it was a trembling of fear. And among white liberals and even the black mainstream, it was a tremble of irresolution and confusion and possibly even a fear of exclusion. Black Power was a different kind of term. It had a different kind of meaning. It had a harder edge than freedom now. Freedom now, nice soft words. Freedom now, as opposed to Black Power. Especially when Black Power was accompanied by the fist. But that didn't come until much later. This wasn't a new, really, this wasn't a new phrase, though, in black language or black politics. Richard Wright had used the term as the title of his book, A Record of Reactions in a Land of Pathos. This was his trip through Africa and his observations about the movement that was beginning to push against European imperialism, the idea of Black Power, that black people in Africa and all over the world could struggle both together and apart to push against the barriers that constrained their lives. I like that photograph of him. But the idea itself was not new either. We heard it very early with Frederick Douglass. In 1862, he laid down an idea about power. Let us stand upon our own legs, work with our own hands, and eat bread in the sweat, I think that's supposed to be of the sweat, of our own brows. When you, our white fellow countrymen, have attempted to do anything for us, it has generally been to deprive us of some right, power, or privilege which you yourself would die before you would submit to having it taken from you. It's pretty tough language in 1862 coming from Douglass, already setting up what it was that African Americans would expect from freedom if it ever came. And he continued in a different speech called What We Want, or What the Black Man Wants, 1865. Speaking of the franchise, the vote, without this, his liberty is a mockery. Without this, you may as well almost retain the old name of slavery for his condition. For in fact, if he's not the slave of an individual master, he is the slave of society and holds his liberty as a privilege and not a right. Again, a reference to power and what power could do. You'll note, though, that even he doesn't exactly use the term that we hear later on. He doesn't eschew it, he puts it into his speeches, but it's a dangerous term in the 1860s. There's another kind of power, too, the kind of power that Ida B. Wells put into her community to organize them in her call for a boycott of public transportation in Memphis in the 1880s. She convinced people using her newspaper to simply stay off the trolleys. Local officials came to her and said, "We don't understand why the Negroes will not ride on the cars. They rode before, but they've stopped riding now. We understand that they are afraid of electricity," which was kind of ridiculous. And she said, no, they were riding the cars before. You're right, they're not afraid of electricity, but they're not getting their dime's worth. And this was another idea for power. If I pay a nickel for a ride, you pay a nickel for a ride, you pay a nickel for a ride, you pay a nickel for a ride, and we all should be treated exactly the same. The power of our nickel is the power to be able to sit wherever we wanted. But for whites, the idea of power was a very frightening one. This is a cartoon from the Raleigh News and Observer from 1898, when the white supremacy and disenfranchisement campaign swept across the South, and in particular in North Carolina. The fear was that whites would be literally crushed under the boot heel of black people. This was the idea of black power as far as whites were concerned. And it got worse as time went on. The vampire over North Carolina, which was called Negro Rule, you'll notice has a handful of white women on one side, in one hand, and a handful of black men, of white men in the other. That we would all be, that white America would be swept up and swept away by the evil of freedom. And there was yet another connotation that black freedom was going to mean, or black rule, or black domination, or Negro domination. All of these names were used for it. That the problem with Negro domination was that if African Americans really moved into the public sphere, if they exercised power, they would exercise that power for the thing that they wanted. Or as the Klan put it, they don't want what you want, they want what you have, your women. As ridiculous as it seems, this idea stayed with us in the South. It stayed with white America in the South. You'll notice in this cartoon there's a white man who's holding the ballot and using that ballot in his hand to protect white womanhood and to hold back Negro domination. That thought wasn't gone by the time we got to the 1950s and to school desegregation. At Little Rock, this is at Little Rock. My students are always shocked when they see this. I'm not too shocked. We saw this again in 2007, 2008, when Barack Obama ran for the presidency the first time. So you can imagine the sense of overwhelming domination or power or supremacy that 5-year-old Ruby Bridges felt when she went to school surrounded by federal guards on her first day. 5 years old, having to pass through a crowd like this one. So now we need to ask the question, though, what was meant by black power? Was it a new strategy? No. Was it an aggressive campaign? Not initially. It certainly was an assertive campaign. Or more ludicrously, people asked, were black people finally going to get whitey? And the answer to that was no, as many leaders tried to speak over and over again. So one of the things that I found in thinking about this is that there are two different kinds of ideas about power. One that was the meaning blacks put on the word, and the other the meaning that whites placed on the word. So on the left side of the screen, I have put up the words that black people used: capacity, strength, persuasiveness, skill, measure, energy, the ability to act, influence, clout, sway, and sovereignty. But the ways that whites interpreted power, their own and their fear of black power, was about control and supremacy, rule, command, dominance, reign, preeminence, authority, dominion. Who was going to be in charge? Who could tell who what to do? Who really had the upper hand? African Americans were thinking about this in terms of power sharing, and whites thought of black power as black domination. One of the things that we often get confused about Black Power is we kind of attribute it to the wrong people. Malcolm X, for example, is always associated with the Black Power movement. But by the time Stokely Carmichael used that term, Malcolm X had passed away. In fact, the Malcolm X who stands in historical cultural memory, let me put it that way, in cultural memory, was someone that whites was really afraid of. But if we stop and think about how all of us go through changes in our lives, then perhaps we can accept how Malcolm X himself went through changes in his life, moving out of the Nation of Islam and moving into more of a mainstream of Black politics. He was not interested anymore in separatism. He was interested in alliances. But the main thing he became interested in was the way that African Americans might be able to use their political clout, if they had any. In 1964, really, they didn't. So from his speech, The Ballad of the Bullet, which sounds much harsher than it really is, he says, it's 1964. It's time for you and me to become more politically mature and to realize what the ballot is for, what we're supposed to get when we cast a ballot, and that if we don't cast a ballot, meaning if we never get the vote, it's going to end up in a situation where we're going to have to cast a bullet. It's either the ballot or the bullet. In this way, we have to see Malcolm X as aligned with other civil rights heroes, like Fannie Lou Hamer. Let's see if the link works. Nope, doesn't. Fannie Lou Hamer testified before the Credentials Committee at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. She was representing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which had organized Black voters and some whites in the South to overcome the segregationist officials who held power in the state. She demanded that Black people be given the vote and that MFDP be seated at the convention to replace the regular Mississippi Democratic Party, which was the party of segregation and the party of white supremacy. As far as she was concerned, they were not Americans, that those people in MFDP were Americans, and more importantly, they were members of the true Democratic Party. So Fannie Lou Hamer goes down in history as this wonderful, brave woman who stood before a major committee. She's on television speaking on behalf of all Black Mississippians. But the thing that she was talking about was power. We want the power to be on the floor at the Democratic National Convention to take part, to cast our vote for the candidate who would most represent her interests and the interests of those Black people in Mississippi. The very first time we actually hear in modern day of Black Power came from a source that I actually didn't know about. I mean, I knew the source, but I didn't know that that was the root. The Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., representative out of New York City to the House of Representatives. In 1966, he gives a baccalaureate speech at Howard University, where he says, human rights are God-given rights. Civil rights are man-made. Our lives must be purposed to implement human rights. To demand God-given rights is to seek Black power. To demand God-given rights is to seek Black power. The power to build Black institutions of splendid achievement. So if we put all of these kinds of Black references together, what we hear is not only power sharing, but that in power sharing, African Americans were demanding not only the vote, but the ability to sustain themselves by their own work economically, the ability to access the things that even the United Nations thinks are basic human rights. And we have to think about this. These are things that Mississippi people didn't have: food, clothing, shelter, clean water, access to education, access to employment, the ability to take care of themselves, to survive, but also to be able to thrive in the world. So now we come back to Stokely Carmichael. Carmichael does his Black Power thing in 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks after. This is so important for historians, the chronology of when things happen. So first there's Adam Clayton Powell, and then 2 weeks later it is Stokely Carmichael who begins to talk about Black Power. And he says we had to begin with politics. He's now linked up with, he's working with and now linked up with the kinds of things that Fannie Lou Hamer and Malcolm X were saying. We had to begin with politics, meaning voting, because Black Americans are a propertyless people in a country where property is valued above all. Those of you who are historians will remember that at the founding of the United States, the idea of having property, you had to have property to vote. If you didn't have property, you couldn't vote. You also had to be male. Eventually that falls away, but the idea of ownership, the idea of being able to own private property was a part of American understanding of power. And he says we had to work for power because this country doesn't function by morality, love, and nonviolence. This is a very frustrated Carmichael by this time. Thus, we determined to win political power with the idea of moving on from there into activity that would have economic effects, from voting to economic effects. With power, the masses could make or participate in making the decisions which govern their destinies. So far we haven't heard from any African Americans anything about domination, anything about rule, anything about control, anything about get whitey, anything about violence, anything about beating, simply a statement of self-assertion, a statement that was really resonant of Booker T. Washington and the Black Women's Club movement, all of whom were deeply involved in strengthening the Black community so that it could work autonomously without dependence or reliance on whites, but for themselves, with their own energy and in their own interests. So here we are with Stokely one more time.
Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. We want Black power. We want Black power. We want Black power. Beyond the sky, it's been a long time coming, but I know change won't come. Oh, yes it will. I go to the movement, and I know how to sound. Somebody keeps hurting me, oh, hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gon' come. Oh, yes it will.
So the shift here is from a change is going to come to we are going to make that change ourselves. A shift from what Carmichael called begging to what Carmichael later calls demanding. A shift from an easy way of trying to get along with people, a sense that brotherhood was going to create a better America, to a sense that action had to take place. And so right behind this, we see a more assertive sense among young people. This photograph was taken at Tuskegee University with a student in whiteface with "Vote" on his forehead, carrying the flag. Behind this is a large, massive group. Booker T. Washington, who had founded Tuskegee Institute, was probably rolling over in his grave to see the students there doing this, but they were intending, as young black people, to seize control of their own lives and to demand the vote. So this was what Black Power had become about: a growing political consciousness, that expressed the ways that African Americans could and intended to exercise their indisputable right to vote. Whites would not get their own way. That's the piece of domination, that whites would not have it their way for once if African Americans could exercise power. And again, we're talking about influence. We're talking about shaping politics with other people, political sharing, or in those cases where blacks were the majority of the voting population, that local issues would swing more towards their way. And so there was great fear among whites, once again, for the term Black Power, as it had been in emancipation and as it had been in post-Reconstruction 1890s North Carolina. If black people wielded power, would they wield it the way that white people wanted them to, or would they wield that power the way that white people had wielded theirs?